in your book, you make a distinction between guilt and shame, where guilt is more of a personal thing, like the cookie, you're feeling it on your own, nobody's watching you. But then you have shame where there are other people involved, and you are being sort of, there's an element of humiliation and so on. And you talk about Christianity being a sort of a sexual guilt religion, whereas Islam and Hinduism and some of these religions associated with honor cultures are shame religions. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure,
and then I'll
sure.
Be quiet and, you guys can ask questions.
No, I think that's a really important distinction, because it helps you see that each religion uses techniques for its particular propagation. Now, Christianity was, if you think about the way Christianity started, it was a lone religion competing against many other religions in the Mediterranean. And it was going up against pagan religions and, Mithraism and Egyptian gods and stuff. So it was in a competitive environment that it had no political power. So it has to find a way to propagate itself. And it found through its roots in Judaism, because Judaism has a ton of religious sexual guilt in it, whereas Mithraism did not, and Asherism did not, and many of the Mediterranean religions were actually more sex positive. They even had female goddesses and stuff like that. So I'm not saying they were sex positive. They were more sex positive than Judaism. Judaism at the time was one of the weirdest religions on the planet because it had so much sex negativity to it. But Judaism is a shame-based religion. Christianity is a guilt-based religion. And let me make the distinction, which will then help us understand why Islam and Hinduism are shame-based. A shame is related to your identity. And if you identify, if your identity is bound up in a given community and the behavior that goes with that community, to violate that behavior not only makes you feel bad, but you don't want anybody else to know. And if they do know, they will shame you. They will then sanction you, socially sanction you. They'll cut you off, throw you out of the community, punish you, disavow you. And there's all sorts of negative social consequences that come with shame, because shame is your identity, and you have violated your identity within this larger community. Guilt, on the other hand, is a rule that you've embedded in your brain, like the cookie example I gave you earlier, and it might not even be related to the community you're in. I can feel guilt about a behavior. I could go to India as a Christian. I could go to India as a Christian and be among Hindus and still feel guilty about masturbating. Whether they do or not, it's irrelevant, because but in a Muslim culture, or in some aspects of Jewish culture, I wouldn't just feel shame about masturbation. I would feel guilt. I would feel shame if somebody found out I masturbated. So if I say I masturbate, and by the way, I do, sometimes more than once a day.
It's a hobby.
It's a hobby. If I admit this to my community, they will shame me for that. And it's a community activity to control your behavior. It works really well in religions that have a lot of communal control. But remember, Christianity did not start that way. It started little pockets all over the place. And when Christianity got to some place like North America or Northern Europe, there were little pockets that were filled against other pockets that weren't Christian or were isolated. So it's harder to maintain a community shame-based system. So guilt became the control mechanism of preference. So basically, you carry the shame, the guilt police in your head, whereas in Saudi Arabia they have the shame police literally walking the streets.
Right. So if I understand this, guilt is what you use when you have a lot of competition, and if you have a lot of competition and competing ideas that might steal people away from you, you need to internalize the enforcement rather than relying on external shame-based from community. You need to get the informants from within rather than from outside, because the external world is competing for you, and that's why you need to build like the internal police rather than an external police. That's why when you get guilt.
It's exactly right. Susanna, what were you going to say there?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's just interesting to me because I have like a journal basically that I wrote when I was 20 about a lot of the shame and just internal self-loathing around my sexuality. And I was studying psychology at the time, so I included bunches of texts actually from my textbooks that helped me understand kind of what I was going through. In a quote that I included from Raising a Moral Child by Adam Grant, this is from my developmental psychology course, was shame is the feeling that I am a bad person, whereas guilt is the feeling that I have done a bad thing. Shame is a negative judgment about the core self, which is devastating. Shame makes children feel small and worthless, and they respond either by lashing out at the target or escaping the situation altogether. In contrast, guilt is a negative judgment about an action, which can be repaired by good behavior. Yeah. Which is so interesting to me. So I see how you mean the Christianity as a whole is guilt because there is salvation through Christ. But I was just sitting there thinking, because to me, based on everything I've studied about the distinction between the two, like what I experience is shame. Like it's about a core judgment of my character, myself.
Right.
Maybe I am because of the communal aspect of how tight of a Catholic community I was in. I was in Catholic education almost my entire life.
Exactly.
But in terms of the theology, I think the assessment of guilt is correct because it can be repaired through salvation.
Yeah. Guilt is I did a bad thing. Shame is I am bad. That's a simple distinction from a psychological perspective. But remember, I'm talking more from a sociological perspective here. And I'll tell you, Catholicism uses shame just as much as it does guilt, probably. All religions use both shame and guilt. All I'm saying is that they tend to go to one or the other based upon their circumstances. In Saudi Arabia, shame is extremely effective. Who gives a damn if somebody feels guilty? Because if you violate something, you're going to get stoned to death or get your head chopped off. You don't need a lot of guilt. Now, that's not to say they don't have guilt. But in your family, you weren't going to get stoned to death and you weren't going to get your head chopped off. So you still need to inculcate enough guilt in there, because when you leave the house, there's no shame police out there. Ooh, there isn't.
That hits.
I did before Ali moved away from masturbation. I wanted to talk about it a little bit more, but he moved away from there. I just want to go back a little bit.
Never move away from masturbation. I don't care what's going on. That's a false accusation, Norman.
False accusation. I do want to touch on it a little bit before we go to asking about Hinduism a little bit. So, is it correct to say, this is my assumption, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, that again, I know there are not people that decided this willingly, but it looks like that. So I'm just going to use the terminology as if they did. Is it fair to say that masturbation was put there as something sinful and vile and disgusting, specifically because especially young men, are going to fail at not masturbating? Like that became a sin because you're going to fail at abiding by this rule. So it was there for failure. They told you not to do it because they knew you're going to fail at this task, so that you feel disgusting, so you do feel shame or guilt, and that you have to come back to the church or to the mosque or to the temple for purification, for forgiveness. And you're going to have to be convinced that this is why you need religion, because you suck so much at being good. And that's why you become relevant. The church becomes relevant, or the mosque becomes relevant in your life, right?
Yes. So if you look at it from this direction, I mean, we've got these no fat movements all over the place, and some of them are even atheists, which I do not understand. Don't masturbate for whatever reason. Well, I'm going to tell you that, notice, there's no prohibition against women masturbating. I mean, they've now started saying that, but go back 20 years, nobody was talking about women shouldn't masturbate. They were just saying men should not masturbate. Even the Mormon church that has an entire program based upon helping boys not masturbate never thought about women or girls until just recently.
Maybe they didn't know women masturbate.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. It's true. Like there's a lot of, not only that, I think it's more known because men came up with all this stuff, so they knew what they're doing, and men just everything's kind of out there, so it's kind of easy to figure out. It's not as easy for women to figure out all the time, but it was men who created this stuff. I don't think they knew.
Well, what Ali was, I mean, Armin was saying, I would generally agree. I think that it's a guaranteed failure. So if you can remember, if I can teach you that your body's your enemy and then you fail at controlling your body, then you've got to come back to Jesus, a la Shiva. You got to come back to somebody to help you get out of the guilt.
Right.
And if it's a shame-based culture, you have to do public penitence in order to get away from the shame that the community is putting on you. And sometimes it's impossible. If a girl has sex in Iran, if a girl has sex before marriage, she is permanently marked for the rest of her life. That's how powerful shame is. Guilt doesn't do that to you, but shame does.